Of CEW's new webinar series. Parishad is Sanskrit for Council. The Council on Energy, Environment and Water is an independent policy research institution established in 2010. Mr. Suresh Prabhu, our first speaker on the Parishad webinar series, was our founding chairperson. CEW uses data, integrated analysis, and strategic outreach to explain and change the use, reuse, and misuse of resources. When we were establishing CEW, Mr. Prabhu had a very clear directive. He said, whether it is policy, whether it's technology, whether it is finance or real action on the ground, it cannot be held in silos, because it is our siloed approach that holds us back from trying to meet multiple objectives at the same time. We are in an extraordinary situation today. The pandemic, the global pandemic that we are all facing and dealing with, some of us have faced personal tragedies, some of us see tragedy all around us, has also led to shocks across the economy, across lives and livelihoods, but also shocks across the energy system. Oil prices are at an all-time low. Power demand in the country has dropped significantly. The execution of projects in the energy sector is held up for obvious reasons. And there are risks of disruptions in the global supply chain of energy supply, whether we look at traditional energy in the context of oil, for instance, or even new renewable energy, such as solar panels or batteries. In the 10 years that CEW has been around, we've been ranked as South Asia's #1 policy research institution in our domains for 7 years in a row. And thrice we've been ranked amongst the 20 best climate think tanks in the world. And yet, as we think about what we do in our 10th year, we feel that we are again at the beginning. We are again present at the creation. But what do we create again? What is the new world we build? How will the energy transition unfold? Are there new opportunities that arise out of this crisis? And are there opportunities that we were already tapping into that get disrupted because of the crisis? Our guest speaker today, Mr. Prabhu, there could not have been a better person than him to address these issues. He's a man of action. He has a penchant for undertaking reforms. And he has an ability to bring stakeholders together, not just to suggest what should be the reform, but actually to enforce it and enact it. And he has done this throughout his career in public policy, which spans several decades, and continues to do so currently. He's currently the Prime Minister's Sherpa to the G7 and the G20 forums. In a short span, Mr. Prabhu has engaged with global leaders and thinkers and delegations across the globe on the issues that we are facing today. Prior to this, he had held immediately before the role of Minister of Commerce and Industry and Minister of Civil Aviation. But Mr. Prabhu has also held many other positions, in fact, 10 cabinet level positions, including Minister of Railways, Minister of Environment and Forests, Minister of Chemicals and Fertilizers, Minister of Heavy Industries. He is, as I mentioned, the founding chairperson of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, but he is also involved with numerous other institutions across the world to push the agenda of holistic development, of integrated development, of balancing growth and environmental issues, and of course, keeping people at the center. What I'll do through the course of this conversation is pose a few questions to Mr. Prabhu to get his initial reactions, get his thoughts on the issues as they're unfolding. But I'd request all of you who are watching us on Zoom or on Facebook Live to kindly send in your questions as well. And maybe halfway through the conversation, I'm going to open up the floor and get some questions in from those of you who are listening in. Mr. Prabhu, let me start with a straightforward question. You've been in public life for several decades. You've witnessed many good things in the global economy and in the Indian economy. And you've also witnessed many crises. How different is it this time?
Firstly, if you permit me, let me just make some remarks on your initial comments. And also, uh, don't get embarrassed when I say that you have done a remarkable job in the last 10 years because you have been my colleague. When we set up this think tank, you are the first one to start working on that, and now it has expanded rapidly, proliferated into many areas and many sectors. But you provided a very good leadership in this last decade. So let me congratulate you.
Thank you.
And also be very happy to note that the organization has grown to such heights that today CEW is recognized as top think tanks of the world in such a short period of time with very limited resources. And this is also a lesson to be learned not by the think tank but by the world community, how to manage best, bring best outputs with least resources. So you have done all that. So it's actually, I would say, the resource management issue also. But in that time, I'm first, I was, as you said, I was a founding chairman, but then later on I'm watching it from outside because I got involved into many ministerial responsibilities and others. Everybody in the world who matters in these sectors respects CW. First, for in-depth analysis, for scholarly reports, but also for independence. It is not swayed in either direction, not to please anybody, not to displease somebody with design. This is something which is a very remarkable journey, and I'm very happy that I'm again back onto CW platform, and I again also would uh, recognize the role of my colleagues like Jamshed Godrej, who is now the chairman, Mr. Tarun Das, and many others who have been part of this process. And therefore, I think this has been a real remarkable journey, and I'm very happy that I was the one who was there with you, and now you're taken it to new heights. And I really hope that this will be the new guiding force for the world at a difficult time like this. Now, coming to this very important issue you asked me, actually, that set my thinking back to years. You know, I don't think anyone now living on this planet has seen anything like this in the past. I don't think. There may be just very few, but I don't think anybody really. The economists say that the last recorded economic history also doesn't provide any guidance as to how to deal with this. The health experts say we don't know exactly how to deal with this because we have dealt with health emergencies in the past. I mean, uh, the day human being was born till today, health has always been an issue. Sometimes it was very confined to small little areas because he was not moving out. But as he started moving from one end to another, he also carried with him some of these diseases. And then because he was traveling all over the world, now the world, but that time the world also was there, but of a smaller scale, he carried along with him. In fact, there are many instances of that, and the history provides also glimpse into that, but not necessarily the guidance into that. So now today is a very remarkable crisis. And also, sometimes people say we are fighting a war, which is true. We are fighting war with ourselves, actually, in this case, because we have created it in directly, indirectly, as humans, and therefore we have to fight it with ourselves. Like the other crisis, I'm sure you'll ask me about that a little later. We'll talk about it rather than asking each other. Is climate change crisis also self-created? But point is, and you're asking a very pertinent question. In 1998, very interesting, and there is no parallels to this. As I said, there is nothing like that. I was in the cabinet of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and India did Pokhran 2. As a result of that, the whole world put sanctions on India. Not whole world, but a large number of countries who matter. Then we were in a financial crisis situation like this. But not no comparison. But I'm just saying there was a slight. I dealt with that particular situation as a member of Atal Bihari Vajpayee's cabinet, and we should be involved into discussion as to how do you react to such an unforeseen, but not necessarily unforeseen, but something which was actually factored in, but yet we have to deal with it. But on the other side, today I think this crisis is absolutely phenomenal, because when we say that world is a war, but World War also, not so many countries were affected. Even World War, actually World War I or World War II, they're not all over the world. Of course, again, that time not so many countries were there because it was the colonial rule. Number of countries were much smaller. Yeah, but still, it was never affected. It didn't go from Latin America to Australia at the same time, covering almost all countries in the region, in the distance. But today, we have this global crisis, but not just global crisis related to only health, which has already translated into financial crisis, economic crisis, and I hope not a social crisis, because unemployment rate in US has again reached the highest ever.
Right.
And people are saying that some of the jobs which are furloughed for some time could be a permanent loss of job. And just imagine the consequence of that. People always felt that you can go to US to fulfill a dream. It's a place where anybody can go and rise to any level. But today, the situation seems to be that US will be battling with the biggest fallout of the health and economic crisis on a social level. And many times we have seen that when the economic crisis becomes a social crisis, people try to find us easy answers to that. So they may not go into the root cause of the crisis as economic crisis, but we like to probably find out that Mexicans are crossing borders and therefore there's a crisis in the United States.
Right.
Or it's a crisis because Indians are going from India as IT professionals and that's why there's an economic crisis in the United States. So that kind of knee-jerk reaction also is a very worrying point. And actually, the problem then would be that we'll be fighting a non-issue. Whereas rather than, and that's okay, but in the process, you might lose sight of the real problem. And today, therefore, we have to put our heads on these two issues. Only twin issues, twin challenges, health and economy. I think we should focus on that very effectively. But I don't know whether I should go beyond this and say something or I should wait here.
Maybe let me pose my related second question, and then I think what you have to say might be related to this. You have absolutely rightly said that there is this danger of knee-jerk reaction when the entire world is enveloped in a crisis. So where does the way I see this crisis is it's a humanitarian tragedy, it's an economic crisis, but it is what I call it's an acute crisis. In medical terms, this is something that is hitting us right now. Whereas something like climate change and environmental damages at a planetary scale are what I call chronic crises. They are with us. That's not just a fever; it's a cancer, and those risks are with us now, and those risks will keep rising. When you say that the priority should be health and economy, where do we deal with the persistent chronic crises that we are also living with of climate change, planetary scale, damages to the environment and our human systems?
No, but actually, thank you, because you have put it into a very good perspective. But I don't think anybody can give a very affirmative answer to the question whether it is also emanating from climate crisis. We cannot say it very for sure, but I am definitely, and I'm sure we'll find the link very soon, and we'll be able to establish this, which is a hunch today, but will become a very proven fact over a period of time, is the fact that, as you said, we delayed too long to take an action on the real issue that was staring at us. That was climate change. Because in the last 50, 60 years at least, or at least 30 years for sure, we have been seeing adverse impact of it. And then till that time, we were not knowing exactly that we were facing adverse impact, but we were skeptics. The people were saying, no, no, this could happen all the time because climate always changes, and which is true. But actually, because we ignored it, despite of very irrefutable scientific evidence, which was proven by world's best scientific minds, drawn from all across the world in the IPCC, but still we wanted to ignore it because the economic cost attached to it. Because we thought we are losing competitiveness. If we do this, then maybe if I do it as a country which was responsible to do it, agreed to do it under international obligation, under UNFCCC, that the countries who are responsible for it should pay for it. I still felt, that country still felt, that if I do this, I might lose competitiveness, I might divert my resources, my domestic resources into taking care of global issues, and we deliberately, I would call it callously, ignored it, and we are deliberately didn't want to pay for it. Okay, this is financial part.
Right.
But because of this climate crisis, what was happening? We're losing biodiversity. Actually, the problem is that we lost biodiversity, and as a result of that, there are natural habitats which are lost. Now, those habitats were obviously of some species, and they had to then find way, and they came into it. Like I live in Mumbai. Now, of course, I live in Delhi. I am today also in Delhi, but I'm originally from Mumbai, which is one of the very interesting city in India, with despite highest population and large number of slums. Almost 63% people live in slums. It has a national park, which is very large, Borivali National Park. In National Park, there are tigers, family of tigers. I'll not say necessarily tigers, but from that family. And that big cat family.
Right.
And some of the big cats then enter the slums or the adjoining areas where people live in. So there is a hue and cry. People say, oh my God, the tiger has come to house, forgetting the fact that he was always there and we have gone into his house. And therefore he's now a little angry that why you're intruding into my privacy, why you're coming here. And tiger will never leave his territory. He always marks his territory, lives there happily. But we have gone into this. So same thing has happened in case of loss of biodiversity led to loss of habitat. And today we are saying, therefore, some of these animals who are living quietly into their places have now come into more and more contact with the human beings because they have lost their habitat. And in the meantime, again, they lost the habitat. Also as a consequence, the human population has also multiplied. Right. So this so-called animal-human conflict is not an animal-human conflict. It is actually humans becoming more and more in numbers than animals are getting into that territory. So today, WHO is struggling, scientists are struggling. There's a fight going on between US and China as to who did it. But still everybody agrees that it is an animal which is the cause of this particular pandemic, that it came from animals to the human beings. So question is, if this loss of habitat might lead to so many such more pandemic coming in, because this kind of diseases were always there with animals, but we never had a problem because we never got infected, because it never got transmitted. It was never transmitted because of the reason that we all were living separately, they were living separately. There was always a red line that was drawn between. But climate change has actually other consequences of climate change. I'm not going into that increase in temperature, loss of water, all those issues I'm not getting into. But one for sure is the loss of biodiversity.
Yeah.
And then there is a separate, at the same time, just imagine, and that's the point that you mentioned earlier, is the silos issue. We have a global convention on climate change. We have a global convention on biodiversity. Most of the countries who signed a climate change agreement also signed biodiversity treaty. But we want to deal with those two issues separately. Biodiversity separate, climate change separate, and pandemic separate. And then economic crisis separate. But what is the root cause? Of course, root cause is you and me, the humans. But I am saying that why not we therefore, it's a time to rethink. And that's what the CEW is doing. You are challenging the traditional thinking, not just to challenge it as a revolutionary, but
Okay.
you are proving with science. You are saying this
So,
is where you are going.
so Mr. Prabhu, then with that context on this, the need for the integrated approach, the fact that zoonotic diseases are also emanating from the impact of humans on the environment, as is climate change, and that then impacts our economic choices. Let's focus on the key issues that we wanted to bring out in this conversation. Number one, how will the recovery from the pandemic, in your opinion, change our energy priorities? There is a priority to get jobs back. There is a priority to get the economy back on hold. And we also have to go through multiple energy transitions: energy access, cleaner energy infrastructure, better energy security. So do you think our energy priorities will change? Will they get strengthened towards the energy transition? Will something else happen? What do you think will happen as we come out of the pandemic?
What could happen, we'll have to wait and see, but what should happen, we can discuss. And I
Okay.
think something which I think what should happen would happen because people have no other choice. But let's go to the first point you mentioned. See, the energy is at the heart of climate change. Actually, the what kind of energy you use, how you use it, and that is what is causing the problem. One of the big challenges is that not that nobody has understood this, but the problem is that I have invested trillions of dollars into creating an infrastructure to cater to a particular kind of energy demand. So I don't want to accept that reality. It is like sometimes I know that I have to do surgery, but I want to avoid surgery because maybe I cannot afford it. I know I want to I want to avoid surgery because I'm waiting for my child to get married. I'm avoiding surgery to think that probably something will happen and I will get automatically cured. So I want to avoid it. So not that I don't know surgery needed, but I was trying to avoid it sometimes by just ignoring it or sometimes by consciously want to avoid it.
Right.
Today, the energy choices is like that. That we know the reality, but we want to avoid it. I think one thing what you can do, what we should do, is firstly, as you said, dealing with both the crises together. Say economic crisis and also climate change crisis now, because health is something which has to be dealt with little differently. Energy being at the heart of both,
Right.
can we think about creating an infrastructure for energy which will create new jobs, new opportunities, but avoid all the pitfalls of the climate change? And
Right.
that could open up new opportunities because in any case, we have got now $3.25 trillion already approved by Congress and the Senate. And also $3 trillion, which is approved by Congress, but to be decided by Senate and not yet approved because both have a different political, different dispensation. Senate is dominated by the Republicans and the Congress is dominated by them. But point is, if you want to do this, I personally feel, though as you know, we both believe in that it should happen as quickly as possible. But just to address this issue, that because we have invested so much into the fossil fuel based infrastructure and also we have created integrated infrastructure in which we generate power at one end and then distribute it all over. And then we have created different kinds of systems which which we abandon it immediately. There could be another consequence of that, even economically. Like today, if you just imagine the complete disruption of the oil market because of oil prices going down, as you said earlier, is now creating huge challenges for shale gas or shale oil producer. So can we find out a medium into this? For example, can we say that we'll make a transition, but not immediately? We'll slowly start making a transition, like in India, as you yourself have pointed out in your various studies as a CW and very scholarly studies, that India's renewable basket has increased to almost 80,000 megawatts over a period of time.
Even more than 80,000 megawatts.
80,000 megawatts in such a short period of time, less than 10 years. How did it happen? We did not dismantle the existing system. That is still going on, but we created an additional system. I think, could this not be a model in which we start thinking about generating electricity, but also other source of energy in a manner that not necessarily, immediately make this existing infrastructure as completely, we have to abandon it.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, Mr. Prabhu. You were, as Minister of Power, you were um, the you were instrumental in drafting the Electricity Act, which then transformed the power sector, the separation of generation, transmission, distribution, and opened up actually opportunities for a lot of private sector investment, and subsequently a lot of private sector investment in renewable energy capacity when our solar mission began. But some critical issues still remain that affect our power sector. Issues of cross subsidies, um, issues of metering and billing, issues of regulatory independence, issues of compliance with the renewable purchase obligations. We are currently countrywide, we're debating proposed amendments to the Electricity Act. But what would be your recommendation, since you're saying that the fossil capacity will still remain with us for some time, even while we build out significantly large capacity of renewables? What would be your recommendations on the sort of regulatory, legal, institutional architecture that can drive this energy transition faster?
I think it's a very, again, it is the heart of the power sector reforms, really.
Yeah.
And you are reminding me of Electricity Act. I will tell you, we used to have huge consultations with almost all the stakeholders. Mr. Ajay Shankar was a joint secretary at that time, he retired as secretary DIPP. For DIPP name, it's now DPIITT. At that time, it was DIPP. Very
Right.
fine officer. And he told me once, and that's something which I keep repeating, but he told me once that, sir, now everybody is exasperated with your consultation, now let's go to cabinet. I said, when they exasperate is the right time to go to cabinet, because that means now nobody has any issues. We have already consulted everybody. But what was the result of that consultation? What is that people were trying to say? Is that what you're asking me? Is the governance of power sector. The real issue of power sector is, one is the source. How do you generate? What is the fuel? That is one part. And that's a technology issue. But technology issue is important, one part of it. But second part of it is a governance issue. That how do you govern power sector? Who should govern it? Should we govern it in a way that I, as a power minister, will decide everything? No, I said, that is why we said power sector was completely delicensed. That means you don't have to come to the Ministry of Power to find out whether I should put up new power, add capacity or not. You can decide on your own. Number two, we did was, how do you make sure that bidding takes place so that it will not be cost plus tariff? All that we did. But even today, what you are saying is a problem, because the reformation of governance structure has not happened as was desired under the Act. And one of the major reform that is necessary is that you should have the owner of power generation. It may be state or private sector. Whoever can own it, doesn't matter. But they will be deciding to make investment on their own commercial consideration or even social consideration. If some state wants to invest money, that is their problem. Okay, that is fine. For that, delicensing already happened, so that part is completely taken care of. The real part is when you actually supply electricity to either industrial consumer, agriculture consumer, or the households, how do you govern that tariff structure? There is already a regulatory boards. Regulatory commissions have already been created for every state, but they are not functioning as effectively as they are functioning. Their appointment is an issue. So like a judicial system,
Right.
where we have a completely, if not as ideally it is, but still better than an administratively that we are appointed, we
Right.
should have a sort of a regulatory system wherein they will be appointed from differently. There can be a separate cadre who could be appointed. Like even there, for example, you cannot appoint regulators only by from school to regulators. You cannot join from university to regulator because there will be two academics. So people will obviously come from power sector utilities. They would have worked in the government, doesn't matter. Like in case of lawyers, only become judges. Nobody becomes judge unless you are a lawyer. So you become, anyway, you are practicing in a particular court and then you join as a judge. It's fine. Same thing can continue, doesn't matter. But a system by which you select them has to be happening separately. Number two, as we are given some sort of a judicial independence in terms of how they run their administration, how are they paid salaries, how they run it. I think all that structure also completely needs independent review, and therefore this should happen. At the same time, We can think about a system. This is something which I was always saying even in 2003 to the regulators, is that you cannot think that your job is independent. Therefore, I am not subject to any responsibility. There has to be a system of accountability for regulators also. And what is that accountability? Let us think about that. The accountability could be that 3-4 parameters. One, to what extent you have been first and foremost, in my opinion, how much effort has gone into making power sector in your jurisdiction. If you are a particular state regulator, in my jurisdiction, how much I have been able to make it commercially viable. That's first and foremost important thing. Number two, in what extent I have been able to improve the capability, the efficiency of the unit by reducing transmission distribution losses, bringing in energy efficiency issues and stuff like that. I think if we can introduce this particular system of regulation working differently, again, the regulators should be qualified people. I mean, they should, so one should be from a technical background, something like that is already there. But I think we should focus on that.
But this is, your last comment is very interesting, because the need for strengthening the governance of the regulatory architecture for power sector is of course important, this creating a cadre, the independence, the accountability. But the last comment you just made, that what is the skill that they have? You know, there's a technical skill, but then you also need maybe financial skills, you need other skills. So let me try and draw you into some critical issues that are unfolding as the pandemic hits us. Renewable energy in India has been, investments in renewable energy in India have been in the order of about $10.5 to $11 billion a year for the past 3 or 4 years, beating investments in thermal power. We have, on the basis of transparent bidding, reduced tariffs in renewable energy to some of the lowest rates in the world. However, renewable energy developers are struggling because either the projects cannot be completed on time because the country is in lockdown, or more importantly, when demand is depressed, when there are other disruptions happening in the economy, they might not be able to fulfill their obligations of delivering power at that very low rate at which they've bid. And this is already beginning to happen. So on one side, some state governments say the prices are too high, or we want even lower, or we are going to cancel contracts. On the other side, renewable energy producers are getting squeezed at the margin. What would you recommend as a way out of this conundrum?
I think it's a very, very pertinent point today, and very relevant, and most important, I would consider in today's situation, is that if the power producers are not making money,
right,
they will never produce power. It's a very simple thing. Even state-owned utilities may continue to produce power only because there is no accountability for them. Otherwise, it will not happen. So this will defeat the very purpose of that electricity. Let me remind you, in 1948, we nationalized all the electricity business in the country, brought in integrated utilities, created state electricity boards for generation, transmission, distribution, all put together. From there till 2002 or 2003, the share of private sector in generation was less than 2%. The Tatas were major one because they were producing in hydroelectricity project. So today, and that time, what was the total problem? So we forget this, but it is very important to remember it. What was the problem? The peak level shortage had gone to 18-19%. So why it came down is because there was a huge investment into power sector, almost more than $200 billion of generation. Now, who invested the money into that? Actually, you can say fund has invested it, but somebody from the household has invested. As a household, my savings I put in the bank. Bank has invested. My household money as a household, as a citizen, I put my money into mutual fund. Mutual fund has invested. I put that money into some other private sector company, which in turn has invested. So point is that investment has made it possible for us to become power surplus in whatever way. The investment to renewables has helped us to realize a clean power dream. But who invested? Again, the private sector companies invested. Now the investor will not make money. The investor will never invest. And then we'll go back to the previous situation in which in 1948, what happened? We nationalized and then we faced the consequence of it. Now it will be actually a reverse of that, in which private sector will go bankrupt. And private sector going bankrupt means state has already bankrupt. So that was the situation even in 2003. We'll have a big problem staring at. So I think first job of a regulator, and in fact the governance system and the power policy should be that we should allow the power sector to be commercially viable. And that's what I said first. But commercially viable power sector cannot become commercially viable if the players of power sector are bankrupt. You cannot make power sector commercially viable and all players are bankrupt. I can understand few players may become bankrupt. That's possible. Because in industry and a firm, the relationship between industry and a firm can go bankrupt, but industry is profitable. A good situation. But industry is bankrupt and firms are bankrupt is the worst situation. And therefore, I think that is something which is emerging today. And we have to address that challenge properly. Again, we should not consider private sector with a completely different, should not judge them on different parameters. I say private means you have enough money, you can do anything. Private sector has actually helped, and that's a stated public policy. That's why we bought Electricity Act. That's why all states supported it more or less during that time. Because I had met all the chief ministers, I had interviewed with meetings with all union leaders. But today, therefore, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And a regulator, therefore, must ensure the profitability, viability, solvency, and cash flow issues of the utility. In fact, if you recall, we had signed an agreement with Reserve Bank of India, state governments, and the central government had tripartite agreement. So that any default to state utility or the central utility will be deducted from devolution. I think quite fine that we never had to use it. But today, I think we should bring in, it's a sacrosanct duty that you must pay the power utility, whether it's privately owned or government owned, by DISCOM, because DISCOM is very comfortably saying, I will buy power from you but not pay for it. I don't think anywhere in the world it can happen. So I think this is a very important thing. We have to do it. And therefore, you asked me probably what triggered your asking, just one sentence of people having that technology or rather technical knowledge, whether it is finance, because this is a finance issue, or even commercial issues, or technical issues as part of regulatory authority.
Exactly. In fact, that is why, at CW, we had found out about 3-4 years ago, based on our analysis, that even for renewable energy tariffs, between 60 to 70% of the tariff was actually cost of finance. So there's no point understanding the technology if you don't know how to bring down the cost of finance. But this differentiation that you drew on between firm viability and industry viability is very interesting. So I want to draw your attention to another part of the economy, which is industry overall. And you've been Minister of Heavy Industries, you've been Minister of Chemicals and Fertilizers. Industry faces some of the highest costs in the world in India in terms of energy costs. And energy costs become a very large share of their total input costs, which makes a lot of our industry uncompetitive in global markets, especially our micro, small and medium enterprises. Beyond the power sector or the industry of the power sector, when you think of industry overall, and you think of their energy transition, their energy efficiency, and their competitiveness, what can we do as we come out of this pandemic, as we think of how to deploy the fiscal resources being put forward by the government towards accelerating the industrial energy transition?
I think we should really try to say that, the new investment will have to be climate proof in a sense. So we have to deal with two kinds of industries. One industry which has been built over the last 70, 80 years or 100 years, which is based on that kind of known technology at that time and an ecosystem that fueled at that time. So that may be based on coal, that doesn't matter, but that's one industry. We have to help them also, but probably we'll have to incentivize the other industry, which will be climate-proof industry. I think we should not just allow the industry which was built on fossil fuel-based industry to die down. It's not a right thing because, as I said, slowly we'll have to have a transition. So we support them in this particular period during pandemic because they're also suffering as much as others are suffering. And they also invested money. That investment is also investment which is coming from India. So it's very important. And jobs are created, everything is there. But if you can actually incentivize by giving more incentives to the investment that will go into the same infrastructure, but which is climate proof infrastructure, then what will happen? Even those companies might think, in any case, the future seems to be this. Why not I make a transition from here to that level? A very good example of that could be uh, electric vehicles. When you talk about electric vehicles will be definitely the future. Of course, with one fundamental rider is that electricity is produced from a renewable source. Otherwise, if electricity is produced from coal and we are going electric vehicle, doesn't make sense. But still, electric vehicle seems to be a future. But should we therefore make it from tomorrow, day after tomorrow? No. We should wait for some time, make incentives. So slowly and slowly, the shop floor will bring in changes. That shop floor based changes will be far, far better because shop floor will be responding to the markets. So if the shop floor market linkage is properly established, and therefore they are making this transition will be good. But today, therefore, a good idea would be that support the industry of all kinds because they need support. But support that industry which is climate proof policies, which is looks futuristic, which is going to help more than others, that will bring in the incentive.
The electric vehicle example is very interesting, Mr. Prabhu. Some analysis that we had done at CW last year showed that in 2030, if 30% of sales are electric vehicles, we would actually add to the industrial value that would come from the automobile sector compared to business as usual, if and only if we increase the indigenization of the manufacturing, the powertrain and the battery packs. So again, now that the government is putting out money, trying to get credit enhancement, trying to boost industry, how can we support this transition so that that indigenization actually happens, that we are not just assembling, but we are manufacturing?
No, this should be a priority because Indian companies, see, India actually, we all know, almost 51% of India's manufacturing GDP comes from automobile sector, 51%. Most of the, therefore, industrial jobs, the blue collar jobs are coming from the automobile sector. This was also situation for US because that's how the blue collar workers were the backbone of Democratic Party and therefore they used to be the one who decide. So Detroit was the one who used to be heading all this revolution. But in India has become a very big hub for automobiles. Many other companies also come. But there are homegrown companies which are also been manufactured in India, either two-wheelers, three-wheelers or four-wheelers. I think what we should therefore do is to and they understand the market. See, at least the two-wheeler and three-wheeler companies in India, they export to 80, 90 countries. So what does it mean? That they have captured the market share globally. So if you can, and they know the market better than you and me. So why not we therefore work in such a way that leave it to them, tell them the guidance, bring some incentives and disincentives both in a manner that they will be able to do that. I think this is the best way to address this issue. So they will also do the backward integration. They might get into those ancillaries and those parts which are today not manufactured in India. So indigenization will also happen. They will also be able to capture the global market properly. And they will understand the issue related to emission. They will understand issues because they are the market forces which are going to influence their shop floor. So I think we should leave the transition in this particular sector to the wisdom of this company with some regulation, but not from tomorrow, not from day after tomorrow. Give it time so that automatically Indian industry will not die. Indian industry will thrive. They will create more jobs. At the same time, we'll move towards a better future, which is far better than today in terms of sustainability.
So, Mr. Prabhu, then let's turn a little bit beyond India to what's happening across the globe. You are the Prime Minister's Sherpa to the G7 and the G20. Currently, the G20 is chaired by Saudi Arabia. The oil prices are at historic lows. In 2 years' time, India will be chairing the G20. Where does India's energy transition and the world's energy transition fit into the G20 agenda? Or how could advanced and emerging economies work together to advance the ideas that you are proposing for India specifically? How can we do that in coordination with other countries?
We are constantly in touch with all other partner countries in G20. In fact, we have been also, in a way, spearheading. Prime Minister Modi has been giving a vision to this whole idea of sustainability. We have been talking about climate change very effectively. In fact, most of the countries agree with us. As you know, in Osaka, on this issue, for the first time, there was a 19 plus formulation. Because one country didn't agree, so the balance 19 countries had to agree together. But that's not bad, because though at least 19 countries think like that together, and I'm sure we'll be able to convince the remaining one over a period of time as we go along. And that happened before the pandemic. This was December last year.
That's right.
Or rather June last year, June last year. So almost a year ago. But today, the situation has changed completely. So the people are started thinking about, and as I said, though not fully established scientifically, but there is something has gone wrong in our thinking about our policy related to climate change. And climate change policies are basically influenced by energy policies. So energy policies will have to be revisited. Is a thought that is coming up all over. If not in the government may not have responded in some of the more developed countries, barring European Union and Japan maybe more than others. But still that thinking is coming. But the public opinion, this is now becoming a far more important issue. So everybody is now battling and they're at a home. But I'm sure once the process becomes normal, you will see these voices becoming stronger and more vocal. That they will feel that we should try to take action. Now in this context, India would like to play a very key role to bring in G20 agenda, the climate change and energy put together. In fact, very good example of Prime Minister's leadership on this front is in International Solar Alliance. In fact, if you recall, when Prime Minister was a chief, now he's a Prime Minister, but when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, he had given us this idea. And you and me as an CW, we are trying to champion it to create International Solar Alliance, which of course could only happen because Prime Minister became the Prime Minister and he took the leadership. Today, we are proud to say that this is one organization based out of India, probably the only multilateral, rather multi-country organization which is based out of India.
Yeah.
This organization is now becoming very powerful. Powerful in terms of influencing public opinion, in terms of showing results. And so that is on one side. It may not be very visible, but become a very strong current to change energy policies in some indirect way. So I think we like to integrate that also when India would be the G20. That is an example of Prime Minister leadership of International Solar Alliance, which has created solar energy globally, even in Africa and other countries. And this was his dream. This was his vision. So why not we use that? So I think G20 should be working on energy transition. G20 must work on energy efficiency. G20 should work on energy environment link leading to climate change. Because energy is not just climate change, but also environment issue. And that is why CW is focusing on that. But environment, climate change, energy, all the issues will become very important. And now the new link, which we never thought there is a link between pandemics. And that of course has to be established. But I'm saying, so therefore all of this will put us to thinking. And just imagine, now just see, if I'm just speaking for 1 minute and just telling you on this issue, I just thought about it. We didn't want to put money, though we agreed and when lofty promises. Billions of dollars, tens of hundreds of billions of dollars we'll give. We did not give 1 rupee also, $1 also. Why? Because money was the issue. What happened? Again, I am saying there is no scientific evidence yet proven, but the pandemic came and now you are willing to put hundreds and tens of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars into saving the economy. Suppose you, therefore, if you make that transition properly, a very systemic transition for energy, environment, climate change issues by investing what is least necessary, then there will not be lockdowns like this. There will not be any problem. This will be a very systematic transition.
Mr. Prabhu, we have just about 9 minutes left, and a lot of the issues you started out with, we are coming back to it. The issue of integrating energy, environment, and climate change in the kind of approaches we take on our approach out of the pandemic. Two issues I wanted to quickly touch upon. One is the role of finance. Right. Again, the work that CEW's Center for Energy Finance has done shows that 40% of the world's population in low and middle income countries get only 15% of global energy investment. And the advanced economies with 15% of the world's population get 40% of global energy investment. How do we get more finance into our energy sector? And related to that is something that I know you also hold very close to your heart, the role of distributed energy. You know, used 10 years ago when we set up CW, it used to be small solar home systems here and there, some microgrids here and there. Now there's a role of distributed energy for primary health centers. There's a role of distributed energy for productive capacity. So how do you, could you comment on these two issues? Getting much more international investment into our energy transition. And what is the future of the energy system? Will it be more centralized or decentralized or something in between?
I think there is no choice but to have a decentralized system. See, like take example of India. We have the 73rd and 74th Amendment.
Right.
That means we want to decentralize all powers of significant nature to our local governments. But we want a centralized energy system. It is completely a dichotomy. We cannot work like that. Same way in the world, if you really look at it, most of the democracies of the world are now thinking that they must give more power to the communities. In fact, even Africans are thinking like that, and they must give more power to communities. And whether they want to do it or not, the communities are demanding it anyway. So therefore, there is no choice. Now, in a situation like this, how can you take away an important power, a real power? Power is a power generation, power itself. That is the power, the real power, because you give economic power, but don't power, the real power, power generation. So can we not therefore have a system which is coming from a much bigger public policy issue of generating power to local communities itself? And that works wonderfully. I remember, this is too old, I think you must visit them once. If it was Meghalaya, I had gone there, and there was a local community. They were, of course, generating electricity mainly that time because there was no solar energy. I'm talking about 2020 years ago. Not so much solar energy. They were doing some hydroelectricity, small. And they generate and they will distribute. There was a zero transmission distribution loss. I mean, there could be some technical loss, but almost nothing. Because community owned it. Community knew it. There was the leadership. The tribal leader knew. He will say, you are stealing others' money because you are not paying for it. So it was all working perfectly well. So I think distributed energy is a future of the world. Now, the question that you asked me earlier. Now making fresh investments for saving economy, we should try to make investment to distributed networks like this, which will ensure that we are not disturbing that. Whatever is the existing network goes on, but distributed network will continue. Then comes an issue of regulation. The regulator then will have to regard this as a very important priority, because sometimes what they will say that we'll do this as long as the grid power doesn't reach there. But if grid power reaches there, then you become, I don't know what happens to you. You're no longer my responsibility. It cannot happen like that. So we'll have to protect that investment. We'll have to ensure there's a proper governance system going into that. Now the second part, which you asked me, I think what was the second one you asked me about?
Financing. International investment.
Financing, yes. So, you know, actually, this is actually a paradox. That energy, everybody wants to pay, really. And this is our experience when I met all the farmer leaders, they want to pay for it. In South Africa, there's a very good example of that people prepay it. Their Exxon, their power distributing company, they prepaid meters. You pay first and then take it like a telephone. So that means people want to pay for it. The point is, in the governance system, people want to do it, but the apparatus is not properly created so that it can really happen in an institutionalized manner. If you create that governance system, each and every country in the world, investors will be protected, number one. Number two, you will make sure that financial investment will go rewarded properly. Today, the people think, and there is a one, in India also this happened before 2003, that state electricity boards were not even collecting money, not paying NTPC. NTPC is our government company, what do you need for it? So I think rewarding investment with a proper manner. You should not say that the investor can fleece the consumer. No. That is why competition. In fact, the competition is the best way. Electricity Act had a competition issue, but we have not used that properly. That is through common access, but we did not happen. So I think all the issues can be addressed. Investment is a very important issue. I must congratulate you because I read your research on this finance, which probably the pioneering effort, because not many countries in the world have done that properly. So I think really very good thing about it.
Mr. Prabhu, you would be happy to know we've actually got a report on South Africa, on Indonesia, and document on Sri Lanka. So we're looking at emerging economies as well. Very quickly, we are almost at the end of time. Two final questions. One is on, again, the role of government money versus private money when we come out, as we are trying to come out of the pandemic. And because of sentiments, maybe private money will not come so soon. Is there a way you think we can adjust our subsidy structure? Our estimations suggest that fossil fuels gets 7 times more subsidies than renewable energy in India. Can we adjust our subsidy structure directed more to the poorer communities, save money, and put that towards building up the productive capacity that is needed? And the second thing, the Prime Minister has often talked about lifestyles and the need to temper our lifestyles when we think about our footprint. Should India continue to think only about our per capita emissions, or should we also think about our aggregate emissions?
See, number one is subsidy issue is very important. And I think this is, again, the problem of subsidies that we have tried to make distinction between private money and government money. See, there's only money. There's nothing like private money and government money. Now, take example. Now, in US, now you are giving package of 3.25 trillion already given, another $3 trillion is coming in, which is only barring 4 economies of the world. No economy has more than $3 trillion of GDP.
Right.
Only 4 economies of the world have more than 3 trillion. So you are giving a package which is more than, barring 4 countries, every other country GDP.
More than 190 other countries.
So anyway, we are seeing that this is my money, government money. The House of Representatives as well as Senators approved. What is your problem? President has signed. It is now, who is paying for it? The money that 3 trillion, 3.25 trillion, or almost the Treasury was saying, the US Treasury, that they have borrowed something like $3 trillion extra. So who will pay for that borrowed money? You will pay from your tax. You mean the US citizens will pay from the taxes? So ultimately, the money has gone to save as a subsidy, maybe indirectly, to aviation sector. Right. From few $100 billion to aviation sector of the United States. Right. Rightly so, till September they are getting a subsidy support. But that subsidy is going to private companies, but coming from public money. So I think if you really look at it as a whole, as a basket, whether it's private money or government money, it's ultimately somebody is paying for it, and there's somebody is always a taxpayer. Somewhere or the other, directly, indirectly, he pays for it. So if he is the one who is going to pay for it, why not you create a proper subsidy structure in which you ensure that his life, what will make his life better? The coal will make his life better, or renewable energy will make his life better. So if I am paying for it, it's at least your minimum thing that you can do is to make my life better. And therefore, if I think like that, then my subsidy, which is completely lopsided and completely irrational today in terms of subsidizing a sector which doesn't need such support because they're already viable. There is a huge infrastructure of billions of dollars that's gone into that sector, whereas the other one is in infancy, struggling, not be able to stand on their own feet. So they need that support, and also in the process will make their life better because this will be climate-proof investment. So I think that should be a very clear thinking on that count. We should try to do it. On climate change, on per capita emissions or others, see, you must try to appreciate India's position on one way. That while this debate will go on whether global emissions or per capita emission, India is making very slowly a transition to a cleaner future. Whether it is in terms of renewable energy sources or whether in terms of providing clean gas, fuel to the almost your own study, 97% of households have got it, which shows that whether by obligation, and in fact, UNFCCC never wanted India to take obligation, but we have taken a moral obligation. We are trying to say that we like to make a better life for our people. Therefore, we'll make this transition, whether it is cooking gas, whether it is electricity for household or others, or over a period of time, mobility. We'll try to bring it in such a way that it will really be helpful. But as I said, we must think about a reasonable time frame for a transition. It does not cause any disruption, and particularly at a time when world economy is so fragile. In fact, I don't know how low we will go, because
Right.
the lockdowns will come now. Some experts are saying we'll have to go into the cycle. Lockdowns open up, lockdowns open up. If that happens again, it will be very bad. So I don't know what is going to happen. This is unknown, completely unknown territory that we are all entering into. But I think most important is India's commitment to cleaner future is evident by the fact that we have made these 80,000 plus renewable energy sources in shortest possible time. We are also making the other sectors more cleaner in terms of fuel. So I think this is very clear, and that in any case, if that happens, then global emissions will go down in India. Then obviously it will also have a positive impact on per capita emission. So I think that is what I want.
Mr. Prabhu, thank you so much. You've covered everything from biodiversity, climate change, the energy transition, the important role of regulators and regulatory capacity in our power sector, the importance of industrial transition by climate proofing new investments, subsidy reform, bringing in energy, environment, pandemics into an integrated framework within the G20, our role in international climate negotiations, but also the International Solar Alliance, but also down to people, the role of decentralizing and democratizing energy down to the community. You've covered it all. We want to thank you deeply for the time you've given. You have a lot on your agenda, a lot that you have to get through. Really appreciate every time you engage with us, and always appreciate the support and guidance you've given to CEW. Thank you very much, Mr. Prabhu. I hope the listeners enjoyed. I've tried to cover many of the questions that came in, and I hope you will join us very soon on the next edition of Parishad. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable. And I started with congratulating you. Now let me end by offering you best wishes for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay safe, stay well, everyone. Thank you very much.
All the best.